It gets me going. I don't know, folks. You know you're in for a treat when you hear that tune because it's time for another edition of the Rec Poker Podcast. Holy cow. My name's Jim Reed. I've got the best freaking job in the world. You might know me as Bluff Sterini in the home games or Rec Poker Jim on Twitter. We're here for the Rec Poker Podcast, the forums edition. Just like every week, we're going to take a forum post from the Rec Poker website, the learning community there. It's free to join. All it takes is an email address and a smile. And because it's free to join, because of so much what we do here being free and volunteer-based, I have to start by thanking our sponsors, Mark Prashon from website AMP, and the wonderful folks at the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, without which we could not do what we do here. We also couldn't do what we do without Wrecking Crew members. The Wrecking Crew is kind of the core team of folks here at Rec Poker that make all the magic happen. I'm just the guy with the mic. But if you want to find out about me and the rest of the Wrecking Crew, you can go to rec.poker/crew or just listen up because you're going to meet a few of them right now tonight.
I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5B5 on Twitter or 5x5 in the PokerStars home game.
I'm Kim Kilroy. I am PatVat_33 on Twitter, PatVat33 in the home game.
And it's not just the Wrecking Crew. We also depend on our premium members for kicking in their $15 a month. That $15 a month gets them access to training videos, live strategy sessions, access to the recording of the forums edition of the podcast, some extra social events that go on. But mostly it's just a way to say, hey, thanks, Rec Poker, for putting the show on and for spreading this love of poker as widely as you do. It takes help. We need help. And so that's why we love when premium members like John Kroll come and join us here in the forums edition of the podcast. And we get to pick his brain, get some thoughts about what some of our premium members are thinking about the subject du jour. So, du jour, the subject that we're talking about is the theme of the month here at Rec Poker. So every month we have a different theme of learning material, and everything that we do at Rec Poker is based around that theme. Whether it's Andrew Feist pulling the Learning with Partners material from all the different training sites that give us behind the scenes access to their material, whether it's Chris Jones' deep dive and his Q&A seminar, whether it's Keith or Kim going through their monthly hand review study session, whether it's my Poker Tracker review session, whatever it is, we're going to try and focus on the theme of the month that month, and we're going to try and release a podcast episode based around it as well. So the theme of the month this month was 3-betting from the point of view of the aggressor. So being the person who does the 3-betting. And if you were listening a couple weeks ago to the Chats podcast with Dr. Alex Sharon, she got into the nuts and bolts of it, basically, because there is some misconception. People use 3-betting, the term 3-betting incorrectly. Pre-flop, the blinds are the first bet. They're the 1 bet. So if you're limping behind, you're really just calling that first bet. Okay, that's a 1 bet, the blind. If you open raise, so let's say you're in late position and it's folded to you and you open to 2 or 3 big blinds, you're actually raising the first bet. So that's the second bet. That's a 2 bet. If you re-raise that bet, then that's a 3 bet. And that's where we get the terminology 3 bet. It's a third bet in order on that street. Now, post-flop, it gets a little more complicated because there are no blinds. Essentially, post-flop, there are no forced bets. So if post-flop, you can just lead, and that's the 1 bet. And if you get raised, it's a 2 bet. People start thinking about every time you raise someone, it's a 3 bet, but that's really not true. Pre-flop, it's when you re-raise someone, and post-flop is when you make that third betting action, that second raise. So just to clarify that. Also, some people I've heard using 3 bets as in they raise to 3 big blinds. That is also not correct. It's not like if you raise to 8 big blinds, 8 bet. That's just not correct. It's just the sequence of the betting and the raising that counts. So we're going to talk about 3-betting today. And this is what Chris Jones has been working on. We had our play along seminar earlier in the month. And Chris is hosting his end of month Q&A. So if anyone wants to come and have a conversation with him and our other members, it's on the fourth Wednesday of the month at 9 o'clock Eastern. And it's a great chance to come and review all the different videos and strategy sessions and forum posts and podcast episodes that we've done all month on the topic of 3-betting. So generally, if you're listening to the show, you're probably not 3-betting enough. Some of you are probably 3-betting too much, but not very many of you, I promise. You're probably not 3-betting enough. And it's you can get in trouble doing it, but with a little bit of understanding of the fundamentals of why we 3-bet, I think it's something that everyone in the recreational poker world should be more thoughtful about and should take advantage of, because it's a cliche for a reason, folks. It works, and it puts money in your pocket and takes it out of your opponent's pockets, and that's what poker is all about. So, Chris, why don't you take us through sort of why you chose 3-betting as a theme of the month and some of the fundamentals involved with its application?
Yeah, well, I mean, you kind of laid the groundwork there pretty well, but I think it's fundamentally a part of the game that if you're used to playing more kind of passively, let's kind of see a flop, see if I hit it, which maybe feels more comfortable, maybe feels more safe, it maybe feels more like I can sort of like see where I'm at and then play accordingly. You're losing out on a lot of potential opportunities and options to you as a player. The 3-bet, and we're going to primarily during this podcast in some of the materials that we talk in our premium areas, we talk a lot about what are the dynamics of a 3-bet hand that then goes post flop. We're not going to really touch on that tonight or as part of this podcast as much. We really just talk about the pre-flop dynamics, like why and when do we 3-bet our opponents. And I think it's such a fundamentally important part of the game that not enough recreational players do as often as they should. But you can also do it. You can just sort of, it doesn't give you just permission just to do it wildly. And so we need to have some understanding about this to like do it effectively. And so I think it's a really good topic to study.
Yeah, it's a crucial part of any successful poker player's game is 3-betting. And I like what you're getting at there, Chris, because there's kind of a mindset shift as recreational players become more experienced. You start off just seeing flops and making hands and value betting when you have a strong hand. And 3-betting has something to do with that, but there's a lot to do with fold equity and kind of the art of poker is not always about making the best hand and getting paid for it. There's some other aspects that are going to allow you to win a lot more chips when you do it.
And I think the where I really wanted to start our conversation around this was really around the idea that we may as players be sort of comfortable with the idea of charts, right? And there are charts, pre-flop charts that tell us about 3-betting as well. But there's something sort of more concrete to should I open or should I not, right? And some of that may change based on what kind of dynamics are at the table, what kind of players we're up against, who's to our left, who's to our right. So those things are fluid as well. But ultimately, a 3-bet is a response to somebody else's action. And that's the first way to, from my perspective, that we need to think about these, is that we are not taking the first sort of voluntary action in this hand. And so therefore, some of the big considerations about how often we 3-bet, what kinds of hands we 3-bet with, are really somewhat influenced by who has taken that first action before us, and where they are at the table, what kind of player they are, and that can really radically change when and where we 3-bet. And I'd be curious to hear other thoughts on this. Yeah, Kim.
I just wanted to say, like, I see a lot of people, especially in our home games, trying to three bet because they see people do it. So I think this is a really good conversation to have here, because often I'll see somebody will make it two big blinds and someone will three bet to three big blinds. So we need to have the conversation about uh, when it's appropriate to do, what sizing it should be, when you have position on the opening player, what size it should be when there's a caller in between. All of those things I think are really, really good pre-flop things to sort of get out there for our listeners to think about.
Yeah. And I think to sort of add to that, like, and what I think you're fundamentally getting at with that sort of point of like the 2 to the 3 big blind sort of raise there, is we have to really think about what is our purpose in taking this action, right? And our purpose is to generate folds, some folds at least, and have strong enough hands in our range that can withstand calls and even sometimes for raises, which those would be 4 bets. But we want to at least generate some folds. And really, I think I would argue that anybody that opened to 2 big blinds, and if we raise to 3 big blinds and it folds back to them, and if they fold, then they are making a gigantic mistake. Basically, they should be basically calling with their entire range. And so we're not accomplishing anything by making that raise. And that's why we want to find sizing that's going to accomplish getting some of our hands our opponents hold to fold.
It comes back to the practice of, we always want to put our opponent to a meaningful decision.
Yeah.
Right.
And let me go back one step from that even. So I don't know if people know why we talk about 100 big blinds being sort of like the typical stack size. Now, in tournaments, obviously, it gets smaller and smaller as you go. But if you're playing 100 big blinds, and let's say one player opens to 3 big blinds and another player calls, okay, then there's those 6 big blinds in the middle, plus the small blind is half a big blind, the big blind's 1. So 7.5 big blinds in the middle. And if you started with 100 big blinds and you bet 3, now you've got 97. And bear with me for just one sec here. If someone bets the full pot, there's going to be 7.5 big blinds in the middle, and one of these players in the hand bets full pot and gets called. Then instead of having 97 big blinds, they've put 7.5 in. Now they have 89.5, and there's 22.5 big blinds in the middle. Now it's the turn. If they bet full pot again and get called, now they're down to 67 big blinds because they had 89.5 and they bet 22. Now they're down to 67 big blinds, and there's 67.5 big blinds in the middle. So on the river, you have a pot-sized bet left. And so there's this beautiful pot geometry that exists where if you open to 3 big blinds and bet full pot on every street, you'll get in 100 big blinds by the end of the hand. So you almost, now people don't just bet pot, but the reason 3 betting even really exists is because when you have a hand really, really good, like pocket aces or pocket kings, you're going to have to either make a bet that's bigger than the pot at some point, which is uncomfortable for your opponents, it's not going to get called very often, or you're going to have to raise on one of these streets. And if you raise pre-flop, then you get a flop that is much bigger than it would be otherwise. And pot geometry just means that now you can make smaller bets on future streets relative to the size of the pot and still get your bottom chip in at 100 big blinds. Or heaven forbid, you have 200 big blinds, and now you really need to bet and raise a lot more to get the hands in when you have really good hands. So if we were only ever playing short stack poker, theoretically, you wouldn't even need to 3-bet, except that it adds all this great fold equity that Chris is talking about. But in the other world, basically, and how 3-betting kind of evolved was people started opening, and then people started 3-betting with hands like exactly aces. And then eventually it became kind of transparent that they had very, very strong hands when they started doing that. And so people started 3-betting with other hands because the people thought that they only had aces when they three bet. And sort of, I'm taking us down a dark road here, but that's kind of like why three betting exists as a value mechanism. And now these days, it's turned into more of a game of, well, you know, I've got aces, but what else do I have? And that's where kind of the art of three betting, choosing the hands that you will put in a three betting range and choosing the opponents that you're going to play against. That's kind of how we've got here.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the conversation is like, so we're trying to, you know, lower the number of bets we need to with our very best hands. We're trying to lower the number of times that we have to like to get stacks in. How do we accomplish that? Well, three betting helps us, as you talked about the pot geometry, it helps us get to that point. But the other thing that it lets us do is you just kind of touched on at the end there, is choose what kinds of opponents or who at the table we're going to be playing against in these spots. And so, for instance, now we don't play GTO, but we can learn from GTO, right? And so, like, one of the things that I think is really kind of interesting, you just talked about 100 big blind hand. One of the things we talk about in the seminar is that if you have an under the gun player in a 9-ring table, and an under the gun player opens and you're on the button, they open you know, a min open, or not a min open, but they open like a standard open, and we're going to three bet them far. And this is something I think we understand intuitively, but maybe not to the degree that we should. We're going to three bet that player, that under the gun player, far fewer times than we are going to three bet that same player if they were in the cutoff. It's like a radical difference. If you look at a GTO, I'm just looking this up here, from the button against a cutoff open, we should be three betting 12+% of our hands against that cutoff open with 100 big blinds. And when we're talking about it against the under the gun open, we should only be doing it 5 to 6% of time. So we're more than doubling the number of times that we are three betting our opponent based on just the position at which they opened. And that may not be for some people, this would be old hat and review, but I would argue that a lot of players are just, they have the hands that they're going to three bet and they just go with it. It doesn't, regardless of where people have opened. And that's something that if you're not paying attention to that, you're not quite doing this right yet.
Yeah, and there's this kind of duality to three betting where obviously you benefit from three betting with your very strongest hands, like Chris is talking about. And then the question kind of comes down to, is this a player who's going to call three bets a lot? Because if they are, you should three bet with an even wider value range of all the hands that are up here at the top of your range. But three bets are scary, and a lot of players will fold to three bets. And so if you're going to be playing against a player that folds to three bets a lot, you might want to, instead of just doing 12%, the top 12% of hands, you might want to actually include some other worse hands that you're not actually three betting for value, but you're just going to win the pot right now because they're going to fold. And now you get to win a small pot, and you didn't have to do it with a very good hand. And poker's all about winning with not the best hand. Everybody wins with the best hand. Everybody wins with aces. Everyone loses with 2-7. So if you have an opportunity to make someone fold a hand that's better than yours, that's kind of the hidden profit in poker. And so I'm sure Chris will talk about some of the candidates we might use for that and why. But this real key is you should be thinking, am I three betting to get called? Like, is this a value three bet, or is this a bluff three bet or a semi bluff three bet where I'm really trying to just end the hand here because I've decided that's the best way to attack this player?
And one of the things that Kim mentioned, and as we're talking about trying to get folds with some of our bluffs, one of the things Kim mentioned at the very beginning was sizing, and we talked about, you know, you don't raise to 3 from 2. But one of the other things that speaking of like where people are opening from, besides the fact that like an early position open has a stronger range and therefore we can 3-bet it less. The other thing that we need to think about is, are we in position or out of position relative to the player who has opened? Because when we are 3-betting them, it's going to matter a lot. When we are going to be out of position against the player who we are 3-betting against, we need to have a much larger sizing, because we want to generate more folds, because we do not want to put ourselves in a position where we are playing a lot of hands in a bloated pot now out of position. So we want to make it even more painful for our opponents to call us and have them make mistakes by calling us with marginal holdings, if they are sort of call happy, or we want to generate more folds too. So for that reason, we want to have our out of position sizing be a lot bigger. Not a lot bigger, but we want to be at, like, so a typical, it's going to depend on stack sizes. It's going to depend on a few things, but a typical sort of 3-bet sizing when we're in position is going to be around that 3x. Sometimes if we're shallower, it might be 2.5. If it were deeper, it might be 3.5. And then when we're out of position, we're going to want to go kind of a full X above. So now we're in that like 3.5 to 4.5, sometimes even 5x sizing when we're going to be out of position.
And it all comes back to what Kim was saying at the beginning about not giving our opponents trivial decisions. We don't want our opponents to have easy decisions. We want them to have difficult decisions. And if I'm your opponent and you're giving me a really good price to call and see a flop in position, that's an easy decision for me, with a lot of the hands that I'm opening with. And if you think about the action as Chris has described, I've already narrowed my range to the hands that I want to open in this position. So a lot of those hands I want to see a flop with, or else I wouldn't have opened with. And so if you lay me a really good price to see them in position, I'm probably going to take you up on that. And that you haven't put me to a difficult decision. You haven't really introduced any fold equity into the spot, and you haven't changed the range of hands that I was going to bring to the flop. So you haven't made your job any easier as someone who's going to be hand rating later on a later street as well. John, did you have something there, sir?
Chris just mentioned sizing your bets based on stack size, but I think stack size also has another role in 3-betting and determine even if you want to or not, based on the stack size of the person that you're thinking about 3-betting, but also the stack sizes behind you, and whether someone, if you're making the bet big enough that you're forcing somebody all in behind you or something of that nature.
Love it. Yep. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the other things that stack sizing may influence us on is if we're short enough, we may not really have the ability to 3-bet without going all in. And so when we get into that point, then this sort of sizing sort of guidelines are just kind of go out the window. It's basically it's an all in or call once we get down to a certain stack size as well. So there's some, these aren't hard and fast rules, but they're things that we should at least be aware of, that we should be fundamentally thinking about as these sort of decisions come to us.
And as Chris mentioned at the beginning, we go into great depth into a lot of these matters in our premium training materials throughout the month. So if you're interested in going a little deeper into some of the stuff that we're talking about here, go drop that $5 at rec.poker. If you use the code RECPOKER, you get your first month for only $5. You can join the strategy conversations, watch all the videos, check out the full archive. We've got an archive of 2 years worth of training videos now on basically every subject you could imagine. And we'll go into more depth on some of that stuff there. But this is just really a primer for the podcast audience to kind of express some of the things that are most important about the concept of 3-betting and how to apply it to tables.
And I guess the last thing I wanted to sort of check in and maybe even just open it up to the group too. I think it gets a little more complicated too. Is sometimes I think there's the three betting option when we just have a single opponent who's raised. But then the three bet squeeze, I think, is another really common dynamic that we find ourselves having to make a decision about what we want to do in these spots. And what I mean by squeeze, if that's not a term you're familiar with, it means that we have an open, now we have somebody calling that open, and now we are sitting there in later position, and we have the option of, well, we could fold, but we can call ourselves, or we can raise. And if we raise there, that is generally called a squeeze, because we're putting pressure on two opponents to make a decision based on our raise. And I think it opens up a lot of opportunities. We can earn a lot of chips this way. There's a lot of quote unquote dead money, which means that like players that call are often, although some players are not, but often not capable of calling a raise with a hand that they've sort of flatted with there. So that can give us, that means that that player's money is sort of just available for the taking. So we can earn a lot of chips by doing this. So it can be a highly profitable play, but we also have to be careful about when we do it. And so we have to think about these dynamics. Where did the original player open from? What kind of stacks are we talking about here? Are some questions we need to start asking ourselves to determine the frequency with which we can do this, especially if we're bluffing as a squeeze. I'd be curious if anyone else has any thoughts on that topic.
I think that's just bang on, Chris. In fact, this will come in more handy when we talk about post flop stuff in our premium training material. But when someone opens in front of you and you call instead of raising, you've capped your range, which is an expression that we use just to say that if you would always be re-raising with hands like aces and kings and ace king and pocket queens and stuff like that, when you take the passive line of calling instead, you're basically saying my range of hands only goes up this far because I would re-raise with these aces and kings and queens. So you're capping your range. When you are the player that's making the aggressive action, your range is uncapped. So you could have all the very best hands, and then you could also have some bluffs. So the squeeze is such an important tool, technique that is really worth pointing out here, because the first player has open raised. They could have anything. The second player in Chris's example has called. So they've capped their range. They probably have a speculative hand or a fairly strong hand, but it's probably not an extremely strong hand. So when you make the squeeze play, when you re-raise and they're in 3-bet, that first player is really under a lot of pressure, because not only are you saying I've got all the best possible hands here, but even if they were thinking, oh, I've got a hand I might not, I don't mind seeing a flop with, and I might continue with, they're really getting squeezed by the presence of that other player who still has to act after they do. So if they can't just call your raise and close the action, there's an opportunity that this other player is going to re-raise and open it up again, or that they're going to go multi-way and have a hand that they don't want to play multi-way necessarily. And for you as the player that's squeezing, once that first player folds, which they often do, it's a great position, because that second player, they've already capped their range by calling once. So they're not really going to get out of line that often. And even when you get post flop, and we won't get into it too much here, you're going to be the player that still has aces and kings and queens and jacks, and they're going to be the player that has now called raises instead of re-raising. So your range of hands is just going to have more equity than theirs. And when you have range advantage and initiative, it's just you're going to over realize your equity in hand. You're going to win more hands than you deserve to based on the strength of your hand, and you can't do that without being the aggressor on a previous street. So it's not just about getting fold equity. It's not just about getting them to call with worse hands. It's also about the way that you represent the top of your range, whether you're actually holding the top of your range or not. You're going to win more pots than you would otherwise. And it's another thing that I think players are not doing enough. Certainly the players that listen to this podcast. And I do a fair amount of coaching with Rec Poker members. I look at a lot of databases and people bring hands to me, and I look at tournament hand histories and that kind of thing. When I pull up a player's database in Poker Tracker 4, I'm always looking at the frequency with which they 3-bet and the frequency with which they squeeze. And you should always be squeezing to a higher frequency than you 3-bet an individual, because the pots are so much bigger. There's so much more money in the middle there. It's worth going after it with some hands that are maybe not even quite as good as you would 3-bet in a one-on-one situation. But it's not the case. I see all these players who someone opens in front, someone calls, and they're thinking, oh, I'm getting good odds. There's a big pot. I can call and hit my hand here. But that's one hand of poker thinking. And you got to think about a lifetime of poker thinking. The million hands you're going to play, you are going to make a lot more money if you are the one squeezing there instead of calling there. I promise you.
Yeah, and I think the last point I'd just add to this conversation, it to kind of jump off what you just said, is that if you have access to a database and you find numbers like you're 3-betting at 3% of hands or something like that, or if you just know you play live, and I don't 3-bet anything besides jacks plus, ace king, ace queen, and maybe that's it, right? If you either one of those things is going to indicate that you are not 3-betting enough, and that you're not ever 3-bet bluffing. And because it's you may think ace king is a drawing hand, and it kind of is, but that's not what I'm talking about when I'm thinking about a 3-bet bluff. A 3-bet bluff is taking a hand that has no business getting a better hand to fold, like a king 7 of hearts, right? And getting king jack to fold. That is a beautiful thing to do. And so if you're never taking that kind of play, you're not doing enough 3-betting.
And not only that, and I know that this month we're talking about 3-betting from the point of view of the aggressor. Next month we'll talk about 3-betting from the point of view of defending against 3-bets. But myself, if I am playing against someone and I know that they only 3-bet aces, kings, queens, and ace king, that is I'm going to exploit the heck out of that player. And that player is going to play, I'm going to play much better against that player because I'm going to exploit them by folding. I'm going to use the weapon of folding against that player. And I'm going to take my chips and I'm going to keep them in my pocket instead of giving them to that player. Mm-hmm. And the way I'm going to do it is by saying, well, they only ever 3-bet queens plus and ace king. So I can just fold my king jack, fold my king queen. I can fold my ace 10. The only hands I'm going to continue with are hands like low pocket pairs and suited connectors that can make a hand that crushes one pair hands like queens, kings, and aces. And then you're going to feel really good about your pair of aces on a queen 10-2 board. And I'm going to be the one with a set of twos there who's you're going to be value owning yourself by the end of it. So part of it's offense and part of it's defense, because if you are a predictable player, that's a problem if you're playing against thoughtful poker players, because if it's easy to put you on a narrow range of hands, it's easy to fold when I'm behind you and to raise when I'm ahead of you, and I'm going to know when it is.
Yep. I've folded to a 3-bet to a large, like a 4 and a 5-bet. I have folded pocket kings before. I have folded pocket kings once in my life to a 3-bet, and I was right. And that is the kind of player that you do not want to be, right? And I don't think a lot of our listeners are that extreme, but you can see how it becomes easy to play. If I know that you're only 3-betting with aces, then it's very easy for me to fold pocket kings. And if you carry on that logic, if we don't have any 3-bet bluffs, you become very easy to play against.
John?
As the only non-wizard in the room, I just want to back up something that Chris said. I'm just really learning now the ins and outs of 3-bet bluffing. But, you know, it's great to turn a set of aces and go on to win the hand. But there's no better feeling than to knock somebody off of a big hand when you have no business doing it. That's when it really gets exciting.
Yeah, it's true. And I guess we should talk a little bit about sort of some of the hands that we might choose. Like, I don't know, I've got this love affair with ace-5 suited that is just, it's my favorite hand. There's no wrong way to play ace-5 suited other than folding most of the time. So it plays great as a call, but it's a really good hand to use as a 3-bet bluff as well. And I'll just say why. So when you're 3-betting, you're obviously doing it with your really strong hands like we're talking about. And then you want to look for the kinds of hands that have certain characteristics to add to that. So hands that have blockers, which are basically, if you've got an ace or a king in your hand, it's less likely that your opponent also has a very strong hand like aces or kings or ace-king. And so more of their range is made up, instead of this part, it's this part. So there's just, they're going to fold more of their range when you yourself have an ace or a king in your hand than they would if you don't. So having a blocker is important if it's the kind of player that's going to fold to 3-bets. But if it's the kind of player that's going to call 3-bets, you also need to have some playability when you are called, some equity when called, getting post flop. So ace-5 suited is a fantastic example because not only can it make a low wheel straight, but it can also make the nut flush. And of course, it can also make 2-pair, but as I'm fond of saying, almost every hand in poker can make 2-pair. So that does not make it a good reason to do anything with it. Yeah, Chris.
Well, and the other thing about hands like that, because the things that you just mentioned, a couple things that I think are really important for our 3-bet bluffs. They have playability. They have some sort of options to make some sort of nutted hands, like they could make a straight, they could make a flush, something like that. But the other thing I think that's really important for our 3-bet bluffs is that we can sometimes get hands that dominate us to fold frequently. So I really, and I think if we're there's this, and we won't get too deep into this, but there's this idea of polarized versus linear ranges in terms of what we actually bring to our 3-bet range. And so the difference would be, do we 3-bet not just with aces, kings, and queens, but do we also tend to 3-bet with a hand like king jack suited or king 7 suited? And in different scenarios, we're going to want to do a more quote unquote linear range, and that would be the king jack suited. It means that it's just a better hand in general. It's got 2 high cards, it's suited, it can make a straight. But the interest, but when we're in different situations, and often what this means is that we are a little bit we're a little bit deeper in some of these situations. A hand like king 7 or king 6 is a really interesting, king suited in particular is a really interesting 3-bet because it has the blocker of the king. It's suited so it can make a flush. But if you think about it, what are you doing with king 10 when somebody 3-bets you? You're almost always folding it. So we can make these hands that have us just absolutely in jail go away. And that's another characteristic I really like about a 3-bet hand.
Yeah, when Chris talks about a linear range, it's just, if you imagine starting at the top with pocket aces and just drawing a line down in order, aces, kings, queens, ace, king, without skipping any hands, a linear range down, you'll get to king jack before you get down to king 7. So it's just a straight down approach. Whereas with a polarized range, you're going to 3-bet all these hands, and then there's going to be a gap of the hands that you call with, like your king jack suited, for instance. And then you're going to have these other hands at the bottom that you're choosing to 3-bet instead. And that's the polarized range, because you've got both sides of that. And you might employ those against different opponents. Some opponents, if they're never folding to 3-bets, you don't want to have a 3-bet bluffing range. That would be shooting yourself in the foot. Players that never call 3-bets, you probably don't want a 3-bet with your best hands, because they're going to fold. And now, if you know that they always fold to 3-bets, and I have stats on players that they always fold to 3-bets. And I'll tell you one thing, I'm not 3-betting when I've got aces or kings in that spot. I'm going to be 3-betting with garbage hands, maybe total garbage hands, if my read's that strong enough on this player, because they're going to fold better hands. So that little secret spot of poker. Yeah, Kim.
I wanted to go back quickly to something John said when he felt good, when he makes somebody with a really good hand fold. That's not really what we're going to do with 3-bets, because really good hands are not going to fold. So it's more about what Chris said, where we're making hands that might be a bit better than ours and fold.
Yeah, that's more correct, but that is what I meant. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want people to think that 3-bets are going to make really good hands fold,
No.
because they're not.
Right. Yep.
People with really good hands are either going to 4-bet us or they're going to call us.
But when we choose, bad hands to 3-bet with, people might fold better hands than ours, which is like another example for the ace 5. And you can see this working, right? So like if you have ace queen and you 3-bet, no one's going to fold better, because the only better hands are ace king, aces, kings, and queens. So no one's going to fold those hands, like Kim says, because people don't fold those hands. But if you 3-bet with ace 5, a hand like ace 7 is going to fold. So that's a huge win for you with ace 5, because they had a better hand than you. They had ace 7, you had ace 5. They're dominating you, and they folded. If you've got ace queen, you don't necessarily even want them to fold ace 7 in the same way that you do when you've got ace 5, because you're the one dominating them in that spot.
And I know we're talking more about pre-flop, but there are situations post-flop where I've gotten people to drop pretty significant hand sets because I've been able to represent the flush or the straight. But I know that's a little bit different than what we're talking about here.
No, it's true, and that's the art of poker. Like we say, that's how you actually profit in poker, is by winning when you don't have the best hand. So the more we can do that, and the easier we make it for ourselves, the more profitable we'll be at the tables. Does anyone have like a hand that they never 3-bet, or a hand that they always 3-bet, or something like that? I always like going for some general rules around here. Like there's an argument for slow playing aces, depending on stack size. Maybe you don't 3-bet it because it doesn't
I always
benefit from
3-bet
protection as
aces.
much. Yeah.
I
I always 3-bet kings. I always 3-bet kings, because it's that mix of being a very, very strong hand, but still vulnerable to those aces. And there's going to be an ace on that flop. Damn it. There's always an ace on the flop when you've got kings.
I'll never. Okay.
I generally 3-bet a lot, so that I always want to have aces in that range.
Yeah. Good point.
I will almost never 3-bet aces in certain situations. When I'm in early position and there's an early position open in front of me, and then like there's an aggressive player to my left, I am flatting 100% of the time. I don't even care if I'm unbalanced, because I don't think they are. But more of the time, I agree that our strongest hands, we're just going to be 3-betting a lot. And I really, in terms of 3-bet bluff candidates, I really like we've talked about some of the blockers, but against players that are going to call me more, I like having some of the suited connectors, and even some of the smaller pairs sometimes, if I'm very deep, because I can win a massive pot, and that is intriguing to me.
Yeah, I'm still coming along on my poker journey to the point where I hardly ever 3-bet low pocket pairs, because I just enjoy the poker style of getting them to a flop and hitting a set. And that's just a little leak in my game. I know that there should be times when I should be 3-betting those low pocket pairs, but
Hmm.
it's
They're
not my
really
style.
just shoving hands when you get to a certain stack depth.
Mm,
They're
mhm.
3-bet shoves. I just wanted to say that I know we're not talking about post flop, but I think it's important to say that one of the advantages of 3-betting pre-flop is that you can represent a lot of hands post flop. No matter what you 3-bet with, whether it was 7-8 suited or ace-5 suited or king-7 suited, you can represent a lot of power and a lot of strength post flop because you 3-bet.
Yeah, and we get, and we talk about this, and I think this is just too deep of a topic for this podcast, but
Yeah.
you get to c-bet a lot, you get to win a lot, you get to it's very hard for your opponent to continue the times that they call you. It always depends, but there's a lot of good things that happen even when people don't fold.
True. Yeah. And listen, we don't ever want to make someone uncomfortable at the poker table with our language or our behavior, but we definitely want to make them uncomfortable with our bet sizes and our action and the choices that we make with our chips and our cards. Like putting people in a tough spot, that's what poker is all about. So
You're
you don't want to
definitely
be.
you're definitely doing this right if somebody is starting to mutter under their breath or talk to people about like this wild jerk kind of player at the table. Like
That's right.
you're onto something.
Yeah. And players aren't going to want to go to war with you. Like the players are going to start treating you more favorably. They might not think that's what they're doing, but they're going to get out of your way more. They're going to open less into your action. They're going to give you credit for having stronger hands. Like this guy always has it, it's going to make you a more formidable opponent. And listen, it's nice and fun to just sit there and call in position every time and see flops and play bingo poker. But you're just going to be trading chips around with everyone else if you do that. And that's a good way to spend some time playing cards with your friends. But if you want to win at poker, you need to be doing something that the rest of the people at the table aren't doing. And that's going to make them a little uncomfortable from time to time. As long as you're doing it with your cards and your chips and not with your attitude, then there's nothing wrong with that in my book.
And I think people that are just starting to 3-bet more, and this is really important in live poker, you need to be aware of how many chips the people have that are still left to act in the hand. Because if we say we're average stacked at 30 big blinds or 35 big blinds and an opponent opens and we 3-bet them to 6 big blinds and a stack moves all in for 12 big blinds, we can't fold even our bluffs. Like we have to call. So we have to know, you may not put as many bluffs in your 3-betting range if you know that you have these stacks after you. And I see a lot of beginners make these mistakes where they'll fold because they were doing it with crap and they really
Oh, we might have lost.
7 deuce, even if they were doing this with 7 deuce.
Yep,
So-
it's a great point.
Sorry if my connection's not stable.
Just for a second, that was the only time.
Okay.
So this is, as Chris said, this is such a big subject. We're kind of throwing a few different concepts at you here in this episode of the Rec Poker Podcast, the Forums edition, as we talk about the theme of the month. We really can't do it justice, but I hope that we have kind of piqued your interest, maybe gotten you to think about 3-betting a little more. And I'd encourage you, if anyone has any questions about 3-betting, email chris@rec.poker. I'm Jim @rec.poker. Kim is petvet@rec.poker. John is a premium member, so he doesn't have his own Rec Poker email address, but you can find him in the forums at 7high11. And of course, just come to the forums and post your questions there. Post your hands there as well, and get some tips from the rest of the crew here on how you can improve or other things you'd be thinking about in the world of 3-betting. And then next month, I'm really excited to start talking about responding to 3-bets, whether it's by our calling ranges, our folding hands, the hands that we choose to 4-bet with, That's going to be a lot of fun as well. So look for that coming in November. Any other thoughts on 3-betting, gang? Only about 1 million. Okay, but we'll save it. We'll save it for the next one. Well, then with that, I want to thank John Crowell, Kim Kilroy, of course, Chris Jones, who does so much amazing stuff behind the scenes here to put this learning material together. And of course, I got to thank website Mark Bershon over at Website Amp and the wonderful folks down at Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. But mostly it's you, the listeners, that we thank. So thank you again, and we'll see you next week.
Headbanger moment. Here we go.
Have a great night, everybody.